Let's look at another place, South Africa. South Africa is so-called getting out of Angola, but they did before, and then they came right back in again when there was, it looked like there was going to be peace in the area. Now, looks like the same thing happened. They're getting the Cubans to pull out. They got their ears pinned back. They pulled away. But now I understand, I heard where they've actually made some more armed attacks
already.
On Angola.
Three weeks ago in London, in the interviews and discussions, this is very much what we were talking about, was what is the guarantee that South Africa is going to respect this? The Cubans pull out, South Africa pulls out. What's going to keep South Africa is violating every international law and boundary in southern Africa. What's going to keep them from going back into Angola? How long will it be before they put their troops back in? And the answer was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And now, interestingly enough, Washington's reaction on this, of course, Reagan had a big aid program to Savimbi, and Bush has promised to continue it, and obviously is clearly doing so. Now, Savimbi's pinned down on the border down there now, militarily, and is a little better off than the Contras are, and he was taking a beating, so the South African forces came in to bail him out. The U.S. Response, they obviously didn't stand up and say, well, we happen to be in there in force with the CIA and we call the South Africans in. Their statement was, I can just remember, back in the task force, scribbling away the wording on the statement, to put...
When you were running the Angola operation.
When we were running, their answer was that it has not been confirmed by any reliable sources that the South Africans are, in fact, back in Angola.
We should, in fact, tell our audience that John Stockwell was the CIA officer in charge of the Angola operation and resigned after that, wrote his book In Search of Enemies that began his process of developing a criticism of the CIA, and has been speaking out as a peace activist ever since. So Angola has basically been a hot point for the whole Reagan administration.
Well, let's strip Angola down just real briefly while we're on the subject. Chester Crocker, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, was talking to some of us in the Africanist progressive side of things, Jerry Bender particularly at the International School at USC, and promising that he was going to negotiate a settlement for Namibia and get the Cubans out of Angola. And Jerry, a friend whom I respect enormously, said that, if you succeed, we'll give you credit for it publicly. And Crocker succeeded. He pounded away and negotiated away, and it took 6 years, and eventually he worked out a deal where the South Africans would give Namibia its independence and the Cubans would go home. And the Cubans are going home, and it's a real deal. And the South Africans are, there is at least some kind of a farcical independence being given to Namibia. The oversight, is it going to work? Are the UN forces going to cover it? Are death squads going to be left behind to keep a proxy control? That question remains. But still, Bender and I, supporting him, were obliged to say, yes, Crocker, you did it. Namibia finally is getting its independence. However, in that fascinating, complex deal, the Cubans are coming home, South Africa is giving independence to Namibia, and getting out of Angola and promising to stay out, even though. But the United States, although arbitrating that thing, did not promise to cease its aid to Savimbi to destabilize Angola. Now that is brass.
But it's also just idiotic. I mean, it sort of confirms your thesis in Search of Enemies, that the role of the CIA is to search out enemies, to fight wars, to destabilize the world. Here's a region that needs stability. There's negotiations to try to stabilize it, and the U.S. keeps supporting these rebel forces to try to overthrow the Angola government that led to the absolutely bizarre situation of the Cubans there that were supporting the Soviet-backed Angolan government, protecting the U.S. multinational corporations. I think Gulf Oil had big
Gulf Oil, which was bought up by Chevron.
The Cubans were protecting against the CIA-backed Angolan rebel forces. So it's not even in U.S. economic interest to destabilize Angola.
When Savimbi was brought to Washington in the winter of '86, remember, he dined at the White House, and yet he went on television promising the aid that he was being given, that he would attack Gulf oil facilities, which facilities had been built by loans which Reagan had approved. In addition to which, he has kept the central part of Angola frozen and the Benguela Railroad shut, and that's Zaire, our big client's only economically viable egress to the sea, is that railroad that we pay Savimbi to keep shut. Meanwhile, the human horror, the Red Cross counts 55,000 people in Angola who have been maimed by Savimbi's landmines and attacks.
And George Bush continues to support those forces.
John, one of the analyses that I heard about the situation was that there was pressure within South Africa to get out. They wanted to get out of the Angolan situation. They didn't want to support it financially, and also there were problems because their soldiers were getting killed. So the United States said, okay, go ahead, pull out. We'll come in and we'll directly supervise the situation and take care of it. So it wasn't a big victory for the Angola government or for Cuba in that respect. It was just a switch of people who were going to control it.
Well, this is exactly the point I was trying to make, is that us, Crocker playing big arbitrator, and we didn't agree to give the region peace. But it is a fact that Namibia is getting its independence. The South Africa is going to try to do what we did to Nicaragua in 1933 when we pulled the Marines out and created the Guard and left it behind with Somoza, in charge. They're trying to create the same type of a situation and have a proxy control of it. From the Cuban point of view, the Angolans are being left facing a dire situation, with Savimbi still being funded to destabilize, and the South Africans still coming across the border, and the Cubans coming home. And in Cuba's interests, and it's very difficult to fault them, because they've sacrificed a lot of their own and their own capital to the extent that they can, and they're not a wealthy country, to stick up for their allies, the Angolans. But this is the point at which they could, in fact, come home with having accomplished, a measurable objective. But Namibia is independent because of what they did.
Yet the independence of Namibia, or any country in Africa, is precarious because of the CIA presence there. Whenever an independent African nation takes a socialist road, or a road that goes against the interests or ideologies of the CIA, they destabilize the government. Kwame Nkrumah wrote a book called Class Struggles in Africa that documented the ways that the CIA overthrew about 25 progressive governments in Africa, including Nkrumah's own Ghanaian government in the 1960s. So if Namibia takes a route that the CIA doesn't like, they can act to destabilize it, one way or the other. So that's really the precarious situation that all independent nations in Africa face.
This is one of Chomsky's best points, is that when a country tries to escape, our first effort is to bludgeon them back into the fold, and if that fails, as it did in Cuba conspicuously, as it did in Vietnam conspicuously, as it's done in Angola to date, and Nicaragua to date, then the fallback is to starve them out, create economic chaos so that they will not be a positive example to anyone else to want to break free. And this is what Nicaragua is facing today. They won the first round. They survived 6 years of constant, heavy-duty military destabilization of the countryside. The Contras collapsed in corruption and chaos and shambles and their own cowardice. And now a plan is afoot to disband them altogether, disband the camps and everything. But Nicaragua is now going to face a vigorous destabilization from the U.S. government. There's this Flora Lewis op-ed piece that was in the New York Times a couple of days ago, the Austin American Statesman today, where she summarizes the situation. A good piece, well done. except she talks about freedom of the press, and she mentions La Prensa, and she does not mention the fact that it was funded by the CIA during this whole period.
And they were pro-Contra during the whole period.
Oh, absolutely. A CIA propaganda piece to destabilize the country, to create
during
panic.
A war, no less, when they were fighting for their survival.
She should have mentioned that. It's a good article. I compliment her, but still, that little detail, and then she doesn't project it further. The Meldon plan isn't mentioned, where the ambassador was funding during the height of peace talks and the Contras and amnesty. The embassy was caught funding people and organizing them to agitate into violence, to provoke.
The U.S. Embassy was funding
Ambassador
Nicaraguan opposition.